just want to introduce myself. Glad y'all are here. Very glad. My name is Russell, and I'm one of the founders here at Tailored Fundraising. And joining me in speaking is one of our coaches, Hannah. And Lindsay, you also see, she's going to be managing chat and the Q&A. And Kavina, who's not on screen, she is on the slides, but not, there she is waving to everybody. She's our marketing director. She's going to run slides. She's fantastic. And we're excited to be with you and looking forward to the next hour where we can talk about storytelling. So we're going to talk about three things. Number one, why storytelling is important. Number two, how to tell a powerful story in 2 minutes. And three, the three types of stories that will engage potential and current partners. And I want to let you know that throughout the webinar, we really do want to hear from you. So at the bottom of your screen, you should see a chat button. This is where you can tell us who you are, where you're calling from, and put any other comments you want to share with us. Just select everyone so everyone can see what you're saying. The other button I want to draw your attention to is the Q&A button. And if at any time you have a question about storytelling, please put your question in this box. This is obviously a live webinar where we can all learn from each other. I guess it's not live whenever we record it and put it on YouTube and I say, hey, it's live, but you know how that goes. Just ask as many questions as you want, and we'll do our best to get to all your questions either live or Lindsay will send you a text via text in the Q&A box. So we also want to let you know that we'll be sending an email to everyone who joined us today, sharing written examples or stories, slides, things like that. And finally, we are going to give you space to write down your ideas for your own stories. So if you could go ahead and get a pen or pencil and some paper, or just make space on a device to take notes on your computer or tablet, that'd be great. Okay, we want to start today by asking, why tell stories? Stories are intrinsic to who we are as human beings. Honestly, we've been telling stories since the very beginning. You could even consider cave paintings our first stories. Today, they continue to saturate our culture, whether it's books or movies, music, dance, even visual art. So at our core, we are drawn to telling stories. I love a good story. I love a good movie. Who doesn't, honestly? So stories can do a lot. They teach us lessons. They pass down information, they persuade or motivate us to action, they help us empathize, and they connect with others emotionally. So throughout history, stories have been used to start movements and revolutions. And there's a reason why the pen is mightier than the sword. Martin Luther King used a story about two children playing together, one black and one white, to give fire to the civil rights movement in the US. And that story was only a few lines long. We want to tap into a similar power when sharing with potential partners and inviting them to join the ministry. And we want to invite them to play an important role in the ministry's story.
So we're going to start by how to tell a story. We are going to look at 3 specific types of stories and how to tell a powerful story. The first is a calling story. A calling story tells people how we have been called. It's where we talk about the specific events, conversations, scripture, etc., that God has used to lead us to serve in this way. We want to help you create a version of your calling story that is more focused and compelling, and that will leave people excited to hear more. For example, it was a wintry Sunday, and my husband, Brandon, and I were attending small group at our friend's home. We can no longer call ourselves small as we had grown to over 20 members. We crammed in the living room together, and Brandon and I chose a soft spot on the carpet. A couple of the men in our group had just returned from a mission trip to Nicaragua, and they were sharing about their time. When they finished, one of them looked straight at us from across the room and said, "I think the Weedmans should go." The conversation moved on as quickly as he spoke those words, but I sat there wondering, why us? When we got in the car, I asked my husband, "What did you think about what Brian said and us going to Nicaragua?" He simply replied, "We could go." So we did. 6 months later, we stepped out of Managua Airport, and it took but 1 second for the suffocating heat and thick humidity to frizz my hair in the worst kind of way. I truly didn't know what hit me. The sounds of cars honking, dogs barking, and locals calling out to me in Spanish were disorienting. But we had finally arrived, and there was great excitement in our hearts of what we were going to be doing there in this foreign place with foreign smells and faces. I will be on the VBS team, and Brandon is going to help with a construction project. Seemingly perfect fits for us. By the end of the week, we had witnessed a lot of good and incredible moments, but we left with more questions than answers about what we saw and did. There was poverty like we'd never seen, yet on Sunday morning, no trace of that, just clean, crisp clothes and beautifully styled hairdos. We were met with smiles, curiosity, and mistrust. We put on a show as a team, and we fell apart as a team. There were clear tension with what we thought we were going to do and what we actually did. We had this sinking feeling maybe we didn't help at all. We left curious, and we wanted to know more. So we signed up for the next trip and the next one, each time falling more in love with the people and more drawn to the complexities of missions. To no one's surprise, one Sunday afternoon, we announced to our small group 2 years later, we're moving to Nicaragua. To this day, our friend Brian doesn't remember ever telling us to go, but thank God he did.
Wow, Hannah. Telling a good story, it's like taking a good photograph. In a photo, you have really to think about what's going to be included in the shot and where to focus. It's the same concept when telling a story. So we suggest 4 storytelling guidelines to help us tell powerful stories. First, we need to focus on a specific incident. Now, we focus by telling people in our first sentence when, where, and who this story is about. So if your calling story is about a time when you were reading a missionary biography and you felt compelled to go, then start by telling us something like, I was reading in bed one night when I was in high school. The focus of the example calling story that Hannah shared, when it was on Sunday in winter, where it was small group, and who is with her husband. So the second step is to crop the story to the right length. So experience has taught us that when telling a verbal story, 2 minutes is often the right length. And as you begin meeting people or talking with them over the phone and telling them stories, you may find that the right length is slightly different for you, but as best you can, try to keep it around 2 minutes. If we only have 2 minutes, we need to think about what details we will include in the story, as well as what details we need to leave out in order to help people see what we want to focus on. Next, we also want to use color. And it's kind of like when you've taken a photo on your phone and you use one of those really cool filters. The filter doesn't actually change the content of the photo, but it just gives it a little flavor, It's the same when telling a story. This is about making the story vibrant. And you can do this by using the 5 senses. What did you taste or hear or see or smell or feel? Choose your words in such a way that you're painting the picture for the person listening. Some of the color in the example story we heard from Hannah was wintry Sunday, soft carpet, honking, dogs barking, which started giving me anxiety, heat, frizzy hair, actually reminded me of Vietnam when I was there for a month. That's a whole nother webinar. Finally, to enjoy a picture, we need to develop it. The next step of telling a good story is to develop a good ending line. So what can happen if we haven't thought about how to end the story? For me, I might keep rambling, or our listeners will be confused as to when the story is over. We might be confused as to when the story is over. We might draw several conclusions and lose the impact of the story. And I'm sure that's happened to you as you've told stories. You just don't know where to end, so you keep going and you have multiple endings. So often I hear missionaries end their stories with, so that's how I was called into ministry, Or, so that was a good story, right? That's kind of embarrassing to say. Yes, it was, but I don't need you to tell me that. So we want to develop a good ending line so we know where to land. So important. And it really reduces anxiety in telling a story, because when you know where you're going to land, you know that you can get there. It may be bumpy or it may be smooth, but you can get there and you can land that plane. So for example, in a calling story, it might be something like, from the moment I knew I was going to be involved in missions, or when I heard about the work that Pioneers was doing abroad, I knew where I was headed. The ending of the example story that Hannah shared was, our friend Brian doesn't remember ever telling us to go, but thank God he did. Let's listen to another example.
And Diane, I like your comment that someone says, isn't that what it's all about? We'll know not to use that ending line with the story. So yeah, let's hear another one. Russell, you have for us one.
Oh, yeah, sure. So one morning, sit at the dining room table in our home in Laos, feeling kind of broken and lost from the experience there. The Lord spoke to me while I was spending time in scripture and in prayer about starting a fundraising ministry for missionaries and ministry leaders. It had been quite a journey up to this point. My freshman year in college, I attended a chapel service that changed the trajectory of my life. We had a guest speaker from a mission organization. I believe her name was Leanne, and she started speaking, but her voice became muffled, like someone had put their hands over my ears. But I could hear God speaking. Russell, I want you to go to Asia. Russell, I want you to teach English to college students. Russell, I want you to tell them about Jesus. When Leanne finished speaking, I knew that I was called to Asia to teach English. I just didn't know when or where I would go. I took the next few years to finish college, thinking surely God would give me the green light and show me exactly where he wanted me to go. Well, he didn't. And instead, he arranged for me to join the fundraising team of a Christian college, where I learned what it meant to invite others to be generous and use the resources God had given them to invest in his kingdom. 5 years later, on a retreat with my wife, in a small whisper, he said, Russell, it's time. So we applied with a mission organization and began fundraising for our future ministry in Laos. I used the skills and experience that God had given me, and within about 3 months, he provided all the funding needed for the ministry. But when we got to the field, I quickly realized that not everyone had the same experience that Bethany and I did. The missionaries I met were doing incredible work, but for some reason didn't have sufficient funding, and it baffled me. So when at that dining table in Laos, God called me to use the gifts he had given me to invest in his kingdom, I said yes, and I started Tailored Fundraising.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you for starting Tailored Fundraising. Many of us here are thankful for that. So what was the focus in his first sentence? Do you recall that? It was one morning at his dining room table in Laos. And some of the color he used was changing the trajectory. We all were anticipating, okay, this is the call, and we're surprised by that. He, like someone put their hands over the ears, who was doing the wah, 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 wah sound as he shared. That's, what is that, Charlie Brown? And then other color was God speaking to him in a small whisper. You can anticipate that. And his good ending line was, I said yes and started Tailored Fundraising. One final note about the calling story is avoid sharing every detail that got you to where you are. Remember the first guideline, focus on an incident. Let's take Russell's story, for example. He started at his dining room table in Laos, but jumped back a few years and then ended right back at a dining room table. And then we also want to resist the urge to share a chronological list of every event and try to keep it focused to that one moment when you knew you were committing to your current ministry. We often hear, well, I don't just have one moment. There were several moments that led to this. And really, that's true for all of us. But what was the moment that you knew God was calling you to this? And what was the moment when you decided, yes, I'm going to do this? So narrow it down to those and share that story. And if your role or ministry has changed over the years, share the story being called to your most current role and ministry. So don't worry about going all the way back and then trying to catch up. For Russell's story, he mentions being broken, lost, but he doesn't go into many details. He could around those two things because they're not necessary for the main point of the story to be made. And because that, they may actually take away from the main focus. So start with the details that are absolutely necessary with the story. And if time allows, you can add the pieces that are nice to have. So start with necessary and add nice if it allows, if time allows. We want to give you some time right now to get started writing your calling stories. So for the next 5 minutes, we want you to write down the outline of your story, start with your focused first sentence, and then add bullet points of important things to mention. Then move on to creating your good ending line. Then if there's still time in those 5 minutes, add some more details and color and maybe weed out some of the bullet points that don't fit in your focus. So we're going to play some study music for those of us who need some noise in order to focus. And if you don't want to hear it, just turn your volume down. We also don't want to bother you. Yes.
Before we get started, just to clarify this slide, it says remember number 1, remember number 2. It's just things, honestly, that you want to remember to share. The important things that you want to remember. So there's that. It's actually a format that I use. I don't normally write out word for word because I'm not going to read a story. I'm going to tell a story. So this is a great format for you to use to tell a verbal story.
That's great.
So, yeah.
That's great. Okay. So once the 5 minutes is up, we'll come back together for the next kind of stories. If you have any questions during this time about your stories, please feel free to put them in the chat. We'll be observing that and paying attention to that, and we'll reply in the chat, but not verbally to distract from the story writing time.
Okay, we have about a minute left. So if you haven't already started developing your ending line, go ahead and do that now. All right. Hopefully you've been able to finish up. I want you to do a few things right now. I want you to take the outline and I want you to circle in your opening line, circle the who. It may just infer yourself. So if it is, that's okay, but circle who, circle when, and circle where. So go ahead and do that because oftentimes you think they're there, but they may not explicitly be there. And it's so important because that who, when, and where actually forms an actual picture in the person who's listening in their mind. Okay, so then from there on, they follow the whole thing. Okay, so it's just so key. All right. The next step, I don't want you to take right this minute, but if you're really going to tell a good story, you need to ask somebody like on your team or just a friend, hey, can I practice a story on you 2 or 3 times? Same story, okay? And take your outline and turn it over, even the first time, and tell the story. You're not going to get it all right. Pick it up, take a look at it again, put it down, tell the story again. And you can have that person time you and see how close to 2 minutes you get. Some of you, it's going to be 4 minutes. You're going to have to figure out what you're going to take out. Some of you, it's going to be 90 seconds or 60 seconds. I've heard somebody tell a 45-second story when they thought it was going to be 2 minutes. So if you really want to tell a good story, it's just really simple, but it's going to take a step from you to go practice that. Okay. So let's listen to an example of another kind of story. It was winter exam week at Cornell, and Deb was asleep in her apartment under a mound of blankets when the phone rang. Deb, I want to jump. Deb was half asleep, but the voice sounded familiar. Julie? She asked, is that you? Yes, I think I failed my last exam and I don't think I can face my parents. I'm headed to the bridge. Deb flung off the covers and jumped out of bed. Julie, where are you? At my apartment, but I'm about to walk out the door. Still in her pajamas, Deb reached for her coat. I can be there in 10 minutes. Promise me that you will stay there until I get there. She ran to the door, shoved her feet into her boots, grabbed her keys, and as she drove, she prayed that God would get her there in time and that he would give her the words that she needed to hear. There was a sound of desperation in Julie's voice and a sense of urgency, obviously, that couldn't be ignored. You see, Ivy League universities are filled with high school student valedictorians and salutatorians. And at Cornell, that means that students who used to be at the top of their class, all of a sudden, their number is 962 or 3,270. The rigor of college courses and the pressure to succeed breed a culture of kids who are obsessed with their grades and fixated on what their future holds. Ashamed of failure, anxious, and pushed to the limit by ideals that are put on them, either by their parents or by themselves, well, it's then that they make their way to Thurston Avenue Bridge. Year after year, despite the rails and nets designed to prevent them from jumping, they plunge 125 feet to their deaths. Julie was in Deb's small group Bible study. If she, as a Christian, questioned her identity about what about the students at Cornell who don't know their true worth in Jesus? The first kind of story we shared was a calling story. The story we just listened to is what we call a need story. And one of the key elements of a need story is that it leaves the problem unsolved. It's so tempting to add one or two more sentences about how that person ended up giving their lives to Jesus, or a doctor came in just in time, or some other provision. But it's important to leave your listener with the feeling of wanting to do something about the problem. It's so important. And when you can share a story like this, when you're inviting people to partner with you, it's really at this point almost where they make that decision to say that yes. Now you're not there where you're inviting them to make a decision, but in their heart, they're making a decision. We've got to do something about this. You know, every epic story has a hero and a villain. So if you've been with Tailored for very long, or you've been to our seminars, our webinars, you've probably heard us say the hero is only as good as the villain is bad. If the problem is already solved, then your ministry has no relevance. So share a story about a person whose problem isn't solved, so your potential partner, they understand the importance of the work the ministry is doing. Or if their story is solved, don't share this solution until later. So why is this type of story important? One, it illustrates the need our ministry will be addressing. And number two, it can be motivating. Many people want to be part of meeting a need or solving a problem. That's why we get involved. That's why you got involved in your ministry. So one of the things we love about stories is that it doesn't have to be your own personal experience to be powerful. The story I told, did that story move you? I hope it did. Did you notice that I wasn't involved in that story at all? If you didn't know, I'm not Deb. I'm Russell. And if you don't have a need story related to the ministry you're going to be involved in, find one. You might find it on your ministry's website. They may have some stories. You could connect with someone on your team and ask for a story, like I did with Deb. I asked her for that story. Retell a story you have heard someone else tell, or retell a story that you saw in a newsletter from someone else, and ask permission before you do that. Or maybe there's even a story in the news that illustrates the need. Again, it doesn't have to be your own story to be powerful. It just has to be a story about a real person with a real struggle to help people understand the deep need for the gospel. So make sure your need story connects to the need you're actually addressing. Okay, so take a minute, literally a minute, and write down just an idea of a story you could tell, or where you could find a story, okay? While you're doing that, Lindsay, do we have any questions?
Not yet.
Anne asked about your video. Russell is wondering if his face is not showing when he's speaking. Is anyone else having that trouble?
It could just be a view setting. In the top right corner of your Zoom window, you might be able to change the view. And thanks, Caitlin. I'm not seeing a problem there.
All right, Hannah, let's talk about the next kind of story.
Okay, so the first type of story was a calling story. The second, a need story. And the final type of a story is an impact story. The impact story is a story that shows the power of the ministry. So let's hear an example. Lindsay, you have one for us.
Yeah, here we go. Masa came to the United States 7 months ago. She was a Muslim, but she was disenchanted with God. She had watched for years as Muslims in her own country ruthlessly took the lives of others in the name of Allah. As a result of these horrific events, Masa began to question the character of God. Why was he so angry? Why would he want these people killed? To Masa, God seemed more evil than good. Shortly after arriving in the US, she received word that her sister's husband had been diagnosed with cancer. Upon hearing this news, Masa again became angry with God. She told God, "I will never talk to you again." However, that's when things began to change. According to her testimony, that's when God began pursuing her. She met a man from Iran named Payam. Payam is a former Muslim that converted to Christianity. For months, Payam shared his faith and the transformation that Jesus had made in his life with Masa. Eventually, Payam brought Masa to our church and then connected her with the city group that meets in our home weekly for Bible study. Payam gave Masa her first Bible in her native Persian language, which she quickly began to read. I asked her if she'd ever had the privilege of reading a Bible for herself. She said, "No, this is my first time." She said, "If I read the Bible in Iran, I could be imprisoned or hanged publicly." As she began to read the book of John, she was confronted with a God who was drastically different than the God who had been portrayed to her. She began to cry as she told me about reading John chapter 3. She said, "I read the 16th verse in John chapter 3 about a God who doesn't hate me, a God that isn't mad at me, a God who's not waiting to see if I measure up, but a God who has always loved me so much that he gave his very own son to die for me." I said to myself, one of these books is a lie. Either the Bible is a lie or the Quran is a lie, but they both cannot be true. Eventually, Masa came to believe that the Bible is absolutely true, and so are its claims that God loves her and Jesus died for her. This week, Masa turned her back on her Muslim past and made the choice to commit her life and future to Jesus. Sunday, May 6th, we'll have the opportunity to baptize Masa as she publicly and freely declares her newfound faith in Jesus.
Wow, that one just gives me chills listening to it. So now, for those of you who may be part of a brand new ministry or you're in a new area, for you and your team, you have to get a little creative on an impact story. So if there's someone else doing similar work that you can learn from and that they're successful in, you can reach out to them. Is there someone doing the work in a similar culture that you could draw examples from, maybe a surrounding country that has similar stories of impact, similar situations or obstacles they're facing? Look for those examples. If you can't find something that is from your specific ministry or in your specific location, find something as close as you can to help the people you're meeting with see how this ministry will have an impact on people's lives. You want to help make that connection for them. So let me share another example. After a long day's work, Giovanni moved to his corner of the chicken coop with 800 baby chicks right beside him. He leaned back in his hammock, rested his hands behind his head, and settled in for the night, perfectly content. Caring for baby chicks was a new role for him and not something he would have ever expected to be doing, even more be happy doing it. He grew up fatherless and in extreme poverty. At just 3 months old, his mother gave him up, and when he recalls his past, tears well up. "I don't have a good memory of childhood. I never thought I would get out of poverty. I looked for drugs and alcohol to cope with my pain." He had worked construction jobs on and spent years sewing jeans in a factory. Around this time, he was beginning to turn his life around and was introduced to a faith-based ministry leader, Brandon. When Giovanni learned the ministry's vision was to see lives and communities transformed by the power of God, he was drawn in. And when he heard that Brandon was looking for someone to be in charge of a chicken farm, providing eggs to preschoolers in the community, he was overwhelmed. He knew this was the job for him. Growing up malnutritioned, it became his passion to see more children get more eggs. So yes, sleeping with baby chicks on cold nights was worth it. But God didn't want to just bring healing to that aspect of his story. Due to his dedication and hard work, Giovanni was eventually promoted to farm manager over a sustainable rehabilitation farm, a program launched to bring healing and recovery to the drug and alcohol addicts of Masatepe. The first man to go through the recovery program began calling Giovanni Father, even though the man was 20 years older than him. But for the first time, he'd experienced the love of a fatherly figure and was transformed by it. Imagine, Giovanni, growing up an orphan, was now being called to be a father to the fatherless. To date, 20 men have gone through the program. Giovanni is an example of a true change maker. It takes just one life to begin changing one community. An impact story can be broader than someone who is saved. It can be a conversation that's begun or a relationship that was deepened by a door that's been opened. Sometimes it takes a long time for someone to come to Christ, and it's okay to communicate that. I like to think of an impact story like a car crash. Sometimes it's just a fender bender, and sometimes the car is totaled. Both illustrations have impact. Up to this point, we spent a lot of time crafting and the wording of our stories, but what are some visual aids we can use to enhance our messaging? We can use PowerPoint, we can use pictures, and we can use videos. Do you remember the need story about the bridge at Cornell, where so many students commit suicide? Bringing in pictures adds depth to the story. This is the other side of the bridge. What do you feel when you see these pictures? For me, it's heartbreaking. It makes it more real. We don't have to imagine it. We're thinking of Julie, where she was standing, how close she was, thinking about what Deb had to respond to. So pictures adds credibility. And it's more than just a story. It's a true report. So it's validating what you're sharing. We can word our stories in such a way to help paint the picture. But if you can find actual pictures or videos to go along with it, that helps people connect so much more. Just make sure that you get permission before using someone else's image or information. Very important.
Hey, Hannah, you know what I love to do?
Yeah.
Because it's kind of like, we say handwritten notes these days are so effective because people just don't do them anymore. If I'm going to show a picture to somebody, instead of doing it on a screen, I actually send it to Walgreens or something and actually get it printed on glossy paper, just like in the old days. I don't even know. Some of you may not even even seen an actual picture in your hand, but because you're that young. But anyway, it makes a really big difference, and you can actually give it to them. So
that's a great example because it's in their hand too. It's tangible. It's something they can look at and remember and reflect on. It's a great tip if you have that option to print off hard copies. That's a great example. So if you work on your stories, be thinking about visual aids you want to use. Make sure they reflect the story. When I searched the internet for pictures of the bridge, or who was it that searched the pictures, she saw photographs taken during all of the seasons. So there's one in the fall, it's really beautiful, but to choose a winter one is more matching to the story. So take a minute, jot down ideas for impact stories and visuals.
While you're doing that, Becky has a question in the chat. She said, when you're doing stories, are they for speaking to people or for writing in newsletters or both? And if it's newsletters, how long should these stories be?
That's a great question. They can be for both. This this format is really intended for verbal. So I think they're more powerful that way. They're more natural that way, but they can be used for written. As far as length goes, it's hard to say. Maybe a few paragraphs would be okay. I don't do a lot of writing of stories, but I do know that the beginning line with the who, when, and where, and the powerful ending line are just as important in a written story.
Yeah, another question is from Caitlin. She said, how would you introduce the story in a conversation? As simple as something like, hey, I'd love to tell you a story that illustrates that, or just what's a way to introduce it?
Yeah. So if you're in a conversation, it's a little different than actually what I would say is a presentation. Sometimes you're sitting down with somebody and you're presenting the ministry. So if you're sitting down and you're presenting the ministry, I would use a pause. Don't tell somebody you're going to tell them a story. Just pause and then start the story. If you're in a conversation, over the phone, or it's a partner that you've interacted with, maybe they're a current partner, I might say, oh man, something happened last week, or something happened a few months ago I have to tell you about, something like that. Or can I tell you about Jenny? A few months ago, Jenny was sitting at her dining room table, or whatever. So I would say that, something like that.
Sounds good. Yeah. One more question for now, and then we'll maybe take some more later. Crystal and Todd said the need story seems really similar to the impact story. So what do you see as the key difference there?
The ending line is really the only difference. Ending line is really the only difference. So check your ending line for sure. Anything else, Lindsay?
Yeah. How is the ending line different? Maybe a little follow-up to that question.
Well, the ending line, I can look through our notes, but the ending line for a need story.
That the need story doesn't solve the problem and the impact story does offer the solution.
Yeah, so the need story ending line leaves a feeling of desperation. And I like to say, I think I said it, like, what are we going to do about this? So if you can't ask that question after a need ending line, then you're not really, if you say, what are we going to do about this? And, oh, it's actually in the ending line, then that's an impact story, probably. So just make sure that there's a difference right there.
Okay, that's it for now. We can take some time for more questions at the end.
Okay, so switching gears just a little bit. Right now, tailored coaches are helping people maximize their year-end strategy, including incorporating some powerful stories. So just want to let you know, if you're a previous client, we would like to coach you over the next 4 weeks in 4 sessions. We would work together to focus your messaging for your year-end impact, then put together a specific strategy and plan and start implementing. And you'd have email access to your coach through the end of the year. So if you need to troubleshoot or need feedback on your year-end strategy, now is such an important time. And you can maximize that time. Last year we coached Phil from Campus Outreach around his year-end strategy. And using what he learned from Tailored, it resulted in $32,000 in additional funding. Same for Scott from the Jesus Film. He said that using Tailored helped him raise more than double compared to the year before. And Thomas actually said that 2 years in a row that he was able to raise $25,000 each year through his campaigns. So, working with a tailored coach can be really effective, but more than that, it can help you accomplish the impact that God has called you to accomplish. Now, if you're a first-time client, we coach you for 3 to 6 months. We coach you how to lead a ministry of generosity, creating a powerful message, developing a detailed plan, So at this point, we would love for you to schedule an appointment with Benny, one of our tailored coaches, to set up a free call so we can answer any questions you might have about whether or not coaching is right for you. And he will help you with potential next steps. So everyone go ahead and just click on that link right away to schedule a time with Benny. I talked to you about the results of the year-end campaign. And so for past clients, for those 4 sessions to really solidify your year-end campaign and for email access through the rest of the year to make sure you're on track, we charge $500. So as you can hear from the results, it's an extremely multiplying effect. For new clients, depending on 3 to 6 months, there are different pricing. So you can talk to Benny about that. But really, really encourage you to get on a call with him. So go ahead and click that link, schedule a time with him. Doesn't he look super fun on that slide? He is pretty fun. So anyway, it's just so great to hear how the gospel is changing lives through stories. And I want to reflect on what we've experienced today. So what is something in this webinar that has been helpful for you? What is something in this webinar that has been helpful for you? Go ahead and put your answer in the chat box and make sure you select all attendees or everyone so everyone can see your answer. So go ahead and do that now. We want to hear from you. This is super important. Type away. Okay, listening to examples. Yeah, good. Good. The process, it makes it so much easier, doesn't it, Crystal, to know the process? I like a process. I like a format, you know? Okay, which kind? Crystal, a coach. Yes, a coach can help for sure. Hopefully you're signing up with Benny if you haven't already. Yeah, examples. Knowing how to end, John, that's my favorite part of a story. My total favorite part. Types of stories, how to break them down. When to tell stories. Okay, good, good. Brief and to the point. Yeah, 2 minutes is such a great length. Really, it is. And you know, you can use stories not just with financial partners. You can use them in your Bible study, or you can use them in all different ways. So, just want to remind you that we'll be sending an email later that will share several stories. I think Lindsay's going to put them in there. They're from our coaches, some of our clients. It's so encouraging for us to help others develop the stories. Just remember, we share these stories. They're written out, but you really need to just share them verbally. It's so much more natural, okay? So Deb, one of our coaches on here, says a 2-minute story is just under 400 words, depending on your speed. So, okay, we really love how Heather Ricks puts in her book, God and Elephants, such an interesting title. We love how she says, stories from the field, the moments that God is using to transform your soul are crying out to be discovered and experienced by those who may never set foot among the people you serve. Capture the delight, the storms, the majesty, the silence. God is in these moments. Stories play a key role in helping people connect with God. They draw pictures, provide the voices to another world, and create experiences through which others can be involved. People want to participate by being given opportunities to worship. And ultimately, fundraising is not merely a task to perform as a means to get to the field, nor should the focus be about money. The purpose is to draw others into the presence of God. When God is experienced and given his rightful place, worship happens. That is what this is all about. All right, it's been so great to be with you today. Lindsay, pop that link in with Benny so that it can be right at the bottom.
I also have another question for you, Russell, before you finish up.
Great.
Yeah.
Great.
Mage is asking, it may just be a clarification too. How can you incorporate all three of these stories into a 3-minute presentation?
A 3-minute presentation or a 30-minute presentation?
Maybe she means 30.
Okay. Well, you can't do 6 minutes of stories in 3 minutes. That's for sure. Okay. So you would start with your calling story, then share a need story. If you're onboarding new partners, I wouldn't necessarily share an impact story. You could share an impact story after, a little bit after a need story to show the effectiveness of the ministry or the potential of the ministry. So calling story first, I usually open with that. Then when I'm talking about the need, then you can use the need story. And then when you're talking about vision, you can use the impact story. Sometimes I don't use an impact story. It just depends. I don't know. Hannah, do you use something? Do you do something different?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're pointing out there, Russell, is just to understand the audience and what you're trying to get across to them. Yeah. Maybe they already know why you're there and they are just looking for an update on what you're doing. So you're going to focus more on the impact of how things are going. And you want to make sure that they're catching quickly onto the vision and mission of what you're doing. So I would just clarify, if you only have 3 minutes, if that's a regular scenario for you, I'm curious about that you're only allotted always just 3 minutes to present, but I'm sure there's just more of, it depends on the situation and to tweak it. But once you have your 3 stories, and I think that's just sitting down, dedicating a half hour to writing these out, then you can pull from them and tweak them to be more adaptable to the scenarios you're in.
Great. What else, Lindsay?
That's it so far. You guys have any other questions? Now's your chance. Here we go. What about if you've already raised support and are more raising for a project or longer term? Do you still do a calling story? You've been at this for a while.
Yeah, it depends on your audience and what you're trying to do. I would say if you're raising money for a project or longer term, probably not. The longer term, if you're onboarding new financial partners, then yes. If you're trying to increase funding from current financial partners, then no, because they've already heard it. Or you can say something along the lines as I've shared before, and get just like a few sentences about your calling.
Well, and it also, to point back, if sometimes our calling story happens at different points. And so if you're calling to the specific project, like if you have a story, then you can tie in like my calling to this project, not your calling to where you're serving necessarily.
Yeah. Again, and we did say that in the webinar that you could use that, but just make sure you don't distance impact from the partner. I think in a project sense, you may not want to use a calling story because you don't want to distance impact in the partner. Anyway, talk with a coach about that. I think it depends on the situation. So, all right, it's really been great to be with you today. And I think we have another question. Hope you're walking away with some valuable stories and storytelling skills. And we look forward to sharing what we've accomplished here today. If you need to hop off, that's fine. If there are more questions, we'll stay on and answer them. So hope you'll have a beautiful day.
Thank you. Okay. Is it appropriate to ask friends to consider supporting our ministry after telling our stories? If so, what would be the approach that would not cross the line?
Hannah, do you understand that question?
I'm chatting with my friends in the chat box. You caught me. You caught me.
Can you help me understand?
Yeah, I'll try to give some clarity, and then maybe you can.
We asked Lindsay and her husband to support us, and they are some of our closest friends.
Sure.
Lindsay and Jacob were in our wedding, so maybe you can answer that best of all, Lindsay.
Oh, no, I think that's part of why you're telling these stories, right? Is to invite people into what God is doing. And perhaps that is going to eventually lead to an invitation to partner. It just kind of depends on where they are in the partner process, right?
Yeah. And you said cross the line. You know, crossing a line is when you make it about you. That's crossing a line. You're not going to cross a line if you make it about God and joining him. Mm-hmm. You're not going to cross a line if you ask for an honest response. Lindsay, would you get on board with that?
Certainly. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm all for being upfront with people about why you're having this conversation. And
you're not crossing a line if you're not surprising them. All these things. Yeah. Yeah.
And our tailored coaches help with that. When you're thinking of people to meet with, we help you process the inclination about who they are and your likelihood of partnering with you.
Right. For sure.
This is a great question. Any tips for missionaries who are stateside, who are doing more clerical work? Like, you know, maybe they have a role like me where they're behind the scenes. How can they tell impactful calling and need stories?
Sure. Well, we talked about finding stories from other missionaries, for sure. You know, I found in some of my work when I'm telling other people's stories, I see a story, but it doesn't have all the components to it. I don't know exactly when it happened or where it started or what's the specific incident. So I might have to get with that missionary and ask a few questions and ask if I can tell that story. So the clerical work, so we talk about, make sure I get this right, Hannah. We talk about the need, the calling, the need, the strategy, and the vision. Is that basically? Mm-hmm. Okay, right? So the strategy, what you do is part of that strategy, but in clerical work, you're not going to focus on your day-to-day. It's probably not a passing thought, but why you're so excited to be a part of this work and this role can be a part of that. So it is tricky, and I don't know if I can, give you a full answer right here. Benny would be happy to talk through that with you over the 30 minutes if you'd like. And we help a lot of people in that position. So if you're feeling stuck or struggling, yeah, definitely connect with Benny.
Cool. And James also asked in the chat, is it not just a matter of developing and leveraging relationships? I think maybe he's talking about fundraising in general and not just storytelling.
Can you say that again, or Hannah, could you answer that question? One of the two.
Well, I may even want him to clarify if he was relating it back to the other questions about reaching out to friends, mm-hmm. and understanding if his question came from that particular topic. James, are you still on to clarify your question?
And Lindsay, can you share the question again?
Sure. Is it not just a matter of developing and leveraging relationships?
Yes, I think he was referring to the friends.
Yay, book Benny.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, well, you already have developed a friendship with those people. So it's just really about the approach and making sure. I mean, we approach friends very similar how we would people that we don't know very well. We just make it about impact. We make sure that they understand why we want to get together, lower obstacles, those kinds of things. So yeah, in a sense. Thanks, James.
All right. I think that's it, friends.
All right. Thank y'all for joining us. Thank you so much. And look for Lindsay to send you some really great stuff from this webinar. Okay. See you later.